All right, let's just dive right in. When you see a sleek, modern electric car silently glide past you on the street today, it's so easy to think you're looking at the absolute bleeding edge of 21st century tech. An overnight success story, right? Well, today, in this explainer, we are completely reframing that narrative. We aren't watching a new technology being born, we're actually watching an ancient, dormant giant finally wake up from a century-long coma.
To really shatter everything you thought you knew about EVs, let me paint a picture for you. Picture this. It's 1842. A gang of terrified Scottish railway workers sneak into a storage shed. They're armed with sledgehammers and they violently smash a locomotive to absolute pieces. Now, you'd probably think this was a classic Luddite rebellion against a steam engine. But here's the wild part. Their target was the world's first electric train. This sledgehammer incident happened before the American Civil War. It completely flips the script on what we've all been sold.
So, to track this massive visual and technological evolution, we're going to hit 5 key eras today. 1. The spark and the bottleneck. 2. The forgotten golden age. 3. Exile to the dark age. 4. The forced compliance era. And finally, 5. The lithium-ion rebirth. Okay, starting off with section 1, the spark and the bottleneck. To really grasp the scale of this saga, we need a baseline. For millennia, right up into the 1820s, getting around on land meant muscle power. Humans, horses, oxen. A horse pulling a cart maxed out at roughly 15 miles a day, and that was just the hard speed limit of human existence. I mean, muscle gets tired. But look at how fast things kicked off once electricity entered the chat. Jumping back to 1828, a Hungarian priest named Ányos Jedlik builds a tiny electric motor and mounts it on a model car. Advancing just a few years into the 1830s, Robert Anderson builds the very first full-scale electric carriage. And then, surging forward to 1842, Robert Davidson builds the 6-ton Galvani locomotive. Yep, the exact one those Scottish workers smashed. The irony here? Building the electromagnetic motor was actually the easy part. The physics were surprisingly straightforward. So, what was the holdup? The absolute villain of our story, literally for the next 2 centuries, was the battery. Anderson's 1830s carriage ran on primary, non-rechargeable galvanic cells. Imagine buying a brand new, incredibly expensive smartphone, and the second the battery hits zero, you can't plug it in. You literally have to throw it in the trash. And worse, these weren't neat little AAA batteries. We're talking about heavy, open vats of acid and metal sloshing around. It was a one-way chemical destruction. The acid ate the metal, and when it was done, you had to physically rip out the components and dump a vat of highly toxic corrosive sludge. Just a complete hazardous materials nightmare. So the whole concept of the electric vehicle totally stalled out. It was just a novelty. That is, until someone finally figured out how to put lightning back in the bottle. Welcome to Section 2, the Forgotten Golden Age.
In 1859, a guy named Gaston Plante completely altered the trajectory of transportation. By suspending lead sheets in sulfuric acid, he created a reversible chemical reaction. When you draw power, the acid bonds to the lead. But, and this is the genius part, when you apply a current back into the system, it violently forces the acid back into the liquid, restoring the plates. Boom, humanity's first rechargeable battery. And the craziest part? Plante's 1859 chemistry is basically the exact same tech sitting as the heavy 12-volt starter block under the hood of almost every modern gas car today. Because of that massive rechargeable breakthrough, by the year 1900, electric cars absolutely dominated the high-end luxury market. And if you think about the brutal contrast between the two technologies back then, it makes total sense. Driving an early gas car was pure misery. They were deafening, they belched toxic smoke, they vibrated so hard they'd literally rattle your teeth. And the worst part? You had to start them with a heavy metal hand crank. If the engine misfired, that crank would snap back with the force of an explosion. It routinely broke drivers' jaws and arms. Now compare that to a 1900 electric car. You had a pristine, velvet-lined cabin, a civilized push-to-start lever, and a perfectly silent glide. Actually, Henry Ford's own wife, Clara Ford, completely refused to drive her husband's gas cars. She preferred her Detroit Electric. And their range? You are not going to believe this. Some high-end electric models in the early 1900s could hit up to 200 miles on a single charge. 200 miles over a century ago! They pulled this off by using Thomas Edison's highly robust nickel-iron batteries. Now sure, they were incredibly heavy, and they honestly couldn't climb steep hills very well, but they were relentlessly durable. The sheer visual and mechanical innovation of this era was just mind-blowing.
In 1900, a young Ferdinand Porsche designed in-wheel hub motors. He placed the electric motors directly inside the wheels, a concept that modern startups are literally still trying to perfect today. He ran into the issue of unsprung mass, which basically means the heavy motors weren't protected by the suspension. So imagine every single pothole sending a massive shockwave directly into the components, just shaking them to pieces. But the fact that engineers were steadily tackling complex EV physics over 100 years ago? Absolutely wild.
Which leads us to a massive narrative cliffhanger. Think about it. If early electric cars were silent, luxurious, reliable, and getting up to 200 miles of range, why on earth did they completely vanish from the roads by the 1920s?
Well, it was a perfect storm that hit right around 1912. First, Henry Ford perfects the moving assembly line, which dropped the price of his gas-powered Model T to under $300. Meanwhile, the electric car was totally burdened by the immense cost of raw battery materials, so it still sat at over $3,000. It was an insurmountable 10 times price gap.
But you'd think wealthy people would have still bought EVs just to avoid that highly dangerous hand crank, right? Well, here is the ultimate tragic irony. In 1912, Charles Kettering invented the electric starter motor. A tiny electrical invention bolted onto a gas engine eliminated petrol's single biggest flaw. Suddenly, no one ever had to break their jaw cranking a car again. Electricity literally killed the electric car. Once the physical danger was gone, the EV just lost its competitive edge overnight.
So lacking any real charging infrastructure and completely priced out of the market, the EV was effectively exiled from the highway. This begins Section 3, Exile to the Dark Age. But they didn't go totally extinct. Kind of like small mammals surviving the age of the dinosaurs, the EV found a highly specific environment where its limitations didn't matter at all and its strengths shined, the British milk delivery route. From the 60s right through the 80s, UK milk floats were almost entirely electric. Why? Well, a gas engine burns out its clutch on a stop-start house-to-house route, but an electric motor delivers maximum torque instantly, which is perfect for moving thousands of heavy glass bottles. They had massive lead-acid batteries and only went 15 miles per hour, but they did their routes at 4 a.m. Their absolute silence was a massive advantage. So the EV DNA quietly survived in the shadows. Then, the geopolitical shocks of the 1970s oil crises suddenly woke the world up to the real dangers of being entirely dependent on cheap gas, and that led to Section 4, the forced compliance era. Following the chaotic, purely visual resurrection timeline of the EV, the 1970s gave us the plastic, wedge-shaped city car. It was essentially a 3.5-horsepower golf cart bought purely out of desperation. Advancing to 1985, we got the Sinclair C5 in the UK, this dangerously low, incredibly underpowered tricycle that you actually had to pedal up hills. It was a total commercial disaster, and it created a deep stigma that EVs were just flimsy toys. Fast forward to 1996. The California Air Resources Board literally forced automakers to build zero-emission vehicles. Reluctantly, General Motors created the EV1, and honestly, it was a technical masterpiece, heavily focused on aerodynamic efficiency just to squeeze every possible mile out of its batteries.
You see, the entire crux of the last 200 years really comes down to this agonizingly slow transition. The motor was totally ready back in 1828, but the chemistry took 2 centuries to catch up. We painfully evolved, step by step, from toxic acid vats in the 1830s, shifting to rechargeable lead acid in 1859, then hauling heavy nickel iron into the 1900s. We finally advanced to nickel metal hydride in the 1990s, until, at long last, in 1998, the Nissan Altra utilized the very first lithium-ion batteries. The technology was undeniably working. Drivers were absolutely obsessed with these cars.
So, why on earth did legacy automakers violently recall and crush their own successful fleets in 2003? The silent killer wasn't some cartoonish conspiracy, it was just math. Dealership revenue. EVs don't need oil changes, they don't need spark plugs or complex transmissions. They completely destroy the lucrative post-sale maintenance margin that dealerships rely on to survive. Plus, automakers had billions in sunk costs tied up in internal combustion patents. So when the government mandates finally relaxed, they didn't just quietly cancel the programs. As the quote says, they rounded up the lease cars, took them to scrap yards, and crushed them into cubes to ensure they couldn't be kept on the road by enthusiasts. Out of sight, out of mind.
But here is the beautiful truth about all of this. You simply cannot uninvent chemistry or physics. Welcome to Section 5, the lithium-ion rebirth. The puzzle pieces were scattered all across history. The lithium-ion concept, the aerodynamic efficiency, the hub motors, they really just needed an outsider to assemble them. Now, the ultimate engineering hurdle was something called thermal runaway. You couldn't just tape thousands of standard laptop batteries together to power a car. If you draw massive power from them, they get incredibly hot, very fast. If even one single cell overheats and catches fire, it triggers an unstoppable chain reaction. It burns the adjacent cells until the entire vehicle just burns to the ground.
But in 2008, Tesla finally solved it. Their true engineering miracle was a super complex liquid cooling system intricately woven between 6,831 standard laptop cells. They tamed the battery heat. The resulting Tesla Roadster boasted a 244-mile range and did 0 to 60 in 3.7 seconds. That single car took the slow, flimsy golf cart stigma, threw it on the ground, and set it on fire with high performance.
So, as we come full circle in this explainer, we really have to look through this 200-year historical lens. We aren't watching the invention of the future right now. We're watching a dormant idea finally get the battery it deserved all along. The internal combustion engine was merely a century-long, loud, messy detour while humanity waited for battery chemistry to mature. The electric vehicle you see today is simply the vindicated ghost of an 1830s carriage, a ghost that finally got its spark back.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly lingering thought. If something as clearly superior as the electric car could be suppressed for almost an entire century by cheap oil, a simple starter motor, and corporate preservation, what other massive world-changing technologies are sitting in the shadows right now, just waiting for their own version of the lithium-ion battery to finally take over the world?